Welcome back to Professional English Baku. I'm Steve, and I'm here to guide you through the topic for today, which is we're going to be talking about phrasal verbs. There's something I don't like to use. There are some authors that like to use phrasal verbs. It's good to know what they are. It's good to be able to identify them so you don't use them in writing and speaking. In general, they tend to be viewed as being a weak literary device that is not showcasing your strengths in getting your point across. So let me go ahead and reduce my picture here. That should be good right there. And start talking about phrasal verbs. So what is a phrasal verb? Phrasal verbs are verbs that when they're combined with a certain preposition, it works together to make a unique phrase with a completely different meaning than the verb has normally. Phrasal verbs are easy to identify because they will always have a verb followed by a preposition that is directional. It's made up. There's so many phrasal verbs, but they're very easy. You'll see a verb followed by a preposition that gives a direction, up, down, away, to. That's generally how you're going to see them. So they should be fairly easy to identify whenever you're reading them, and if you happen to write them, you will also be able to identify them. For example, there we go. For example, Steve gave up his place in line for email to take. So the phrasal verb give up means to surrender. Either you're surrendering in defeat, okay, I give up, or to transfer possession of something unwillingly. In this particular sentence, I transferred my place in line to Emil, and I wasn't very happy about it, but did it anyway. Now, the verb gave, is the verb meaning to transfer possession of. And up is obviously a direction. So you can tell right away that is 100% a phrasal verb, because you're talking about a verb and you're talking about a direction. And it has nothing to do with the rest of the sentence, right? Because I could not physically transfer possession of a place in line in an upwards direction. It makes no sense, right? I cannot take my place in line and move it up. So that's why it's a phrasal verb. The phrasal verb, remember, is a verb turned into a short phrase that gives it different meaning than the verb itself. Another example here. Steve held up the bank and ran away with $10,000. The phrasal verb hold up means to rob. Now you can start to see some of the problem with phrasal verbs is you have to know exactly what that phrasal verb means, or it's not going to make any sense. If English is not your native language and you're learning words as you go, you have to learn words, and then you have to learn phrases with conjunctions of word that have nothing to do with the original words. So phrasal verbs are a nuisance at best. So the phrasal verb hold up means to rob. So the verb hold means to maintain possession of. And up, again, is a direction. While it is possible for Steve to hold something up, as in Steve held the wire fence up while I crawled under it, In the case of the bank, Steve cannot hold up a bank, right? So it obviously means something else. That's how you know that this is a phrasal verb. When the literal definition doesn't make any sense, then you have to start thinking, okay, this is probably a phrasal verb. And note that there's another verb preposition in this example. It says, Steve held up the bank and ran away with. So somebody could look at that and go, oh, well, that looks like a phrasal verb as well. Ran away. It's a verb and it's a direction. The only difference is it makes sense, right? If you're running, you are going in a direction, right? So if you're running away, run, the action, away is how that action is occurring. So it's not a phrasal verb because it definitely describes the act of running and the direction, which is away. Okay? Now, a general rule for using phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs are generally viewed as being a weak literary device. In 100% of the instances where a writer or a speaker is going to use a phrasal verb, there is always going to be an alternative means to write it or to say it that you do not use a phrasal verb. And I'll show you right here. Remember the first example of Steve held up the bank. No. Steve gave up his place in line. So I said, I could rewrite it as Steve surrendered his place in line to Emil. Same meaning, but now it's very clear because the term gave and up is not there anymore. So I got rid of the phrasal verb and I put in a verb that makes sense. Steve let Emil take his place in line. Even more simple, which is, exactly what I did. I let Emil take my place in line. So it has the same meaning, but you're not using a phrasal verb. Or for the second example, I said Steve held up the bank. Steve robbed the bank. In the definition of held up, it means to rob as a phrasal verb. So I just get rid of the phrasal verb altogether and say Steve robbed the bank. Simple enough. It is generally very simple to replace a phrasal verb with a verb and a preposition, which will make the text more concise and easier for the reader and listener to understand. So the rules for the use of phrasal verbs. If you are writing or telling a story and you want to either show the dialogue of the character or you want to quote another person, if you're telling the story and you want to quote another person, or if you're writing a story and you want to show the dialogue in quotation marks, then you can use phrasal verbs to give the story some authenticity, especially for less formal characters. For example, you're writing a story about a pair of lovers who have had a fight, and you want to show how they repaired their relationship. You could write, Elmira then said to Ganai, Iqbal and I were arguing for 2 days, but we finally made up. So you can see, made up is a phrasal verb. But because you're quoting someone else, or in this instance, writing a story, and you want to give it that kind of natural flow, then you can use it. And in the same consideration, you could use phrasal verbs when you're having informal conversations with your friends, and that assumes that they have knowledge of that phrase. You can use a phrasal verb, and if the person's not a native English speaker and they're not familiar with the phrase, what you just said may not make a lot of sense. So keep in consideration if you can use it in casual conversation if you're pretty sure that the person you're talking to is going to understand what you're saying. Otherwise, don't use phrasal verbs. Particularly in professional writing and speaking, do not use phrasal verbs. Whenever you use a phrasal verb, it just, the listener, the reader is going to appear to be, have that understanding that the writer and the speaker is a little bit weak in their utilization of the English language. And part of the intent of learning higher English skills is not really to learn literary devices that will make you appear to be less skilled in English. So yes, phrasal verbs exist, but in general, try not to use them. Also, a word of warning, phrasal verbs are poorly translated. Because a phrasal verb is a combination of a verb and a preposition that contains a completely different meaning from the base verb. So it's very difficult for, say, Google Translate to properly translate, because Google Translate takes word by word. And they're not combining words together to make a phrasal verb to translate that. That's why sometimes when you use Google Translate, it's going to make no sense, because the literary device, in this case a phrasal verb, changes the meaning from what the words should be meaning. So phrasal verbs are just poorly translated. So if you want to be clear with your writing and speaking across languages, then avoid the use of phrasal verbs. If you know what you're going to be saying, or if what you're saying is going to be translated, if it's going to be interpreted, then you want to avoid phrasal verbs altogether. So in general, practice not using phrasal verbs. This is my advice. Don't use them. They have very, very small literary use, and that's only for telling a story. But practice identifying phrasal verbs. So you know them when you see them in writing. You'll be able to identify, that's a phrasal verb. It's nice to know what it looks like, so that whenever you're looking at what you've written, you can go back and say, I used a phrasal verb here. I need to replace that with something else. Let me take a look at that. So look at other people's writings. Whenever you're reading books, reading newspaper, reading articles online, textbooks, whatever, try to point out some phrasal verbs so that you start getting familiar. And remember, a phrasal verb is always going to be a verb, an action, in a direction that makes no sense in the context of the sentence. Gave up. Made up. Ran into. I ran into Margaret at the store. I didn't literally run into her, so that makes no sense. It must be a phrasal verb. So that's what I've got on phrasal verbs. They're pretty easy to identify once you understand that it's an action, a verb, mixed with a preposition, which is going to be in a direction, and the two together make no sense independently. Ran into, you can say, I ran into the market. That's not a phrasal verb, because you did run into the market. Now, it is a phrasal verb if you were walking. If you say, I ran into the market, but you were walking, now you're using it as a phrasal verb. So anyway, that's the phrasal verbs, and I've got one challenge example here for you. So what I want you to do is read through this example, and then answer the questions. Leave a comment down below and tell me what you think the answers are to these questions. And if you like what you're seeing in these videos, if you think it's working out for you, giving you some good information, please subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment. If you have any questions, if you have any topics that you would like to see discussed further on English language, go ahead and leave a comment. Actually, this topic here is from a comment on the video I made yesterday. So definitely leave a comment on something you want to learn more about, and I'll get a video up on it. Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a good day.